So what we're going to find out in time is that the pre-wrath position gains a lot of its chronology from passages of the Bible that are building on top of one another, going all the way back to the Old Testament books of Daniel, Isaiah, Joel, Zechariah, Zephaniah, Malachi, Amos. I know I'm not reading them, I'm not naming them off in the order that they show up in the Old Testament, but we've got a lot of Old Testament prophecies that talk about the day of the Lord. And then built on that, we have Jesus coming along and giving us further progressive revelation in the New Testament, the Apostolic Scriptures, with chapters out of all of the synoptic gospels, predominantly Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 17, and Luke 21. So that's major backbone passages that Yeshua brings into the discussion for ascertaining timing and sequencing of end-time events, day of the Lord, things like that. And then we have Paul coming along and getting further progressive revelation built on top of that, giving more detail like we just read here in this Thessalonian letters. We also have 1 Corinthians chapter 15, which is a very prominent resurrection passage that we're all familiar with, right? It's the verse that's tacked up over the nurseries of most Baptist churches that reads, quote, "We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed." Speaking of all those babies who need their dirty diapers changed, right? We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. Well, that's a rapture passage. Well, so Paul's giving further illumination given by the Lord himself about the timing of the day of the Lord here in his Thessalonian letters. And then we have some other minor details that get pulled in from 1st and 2nd Peter. And then lastly, we get the kind of the magnum card of the crowning book on top of it all for eschatology, the book of Revelation. And that's where Jesus gives copious amount of details and timing and sequencing that puts all of the puzzle pieces together for us. Even though it's very cryptic, it's apocalyptic, it's mysterious in its symbology. Nevertheless, enough of it is understandable from a face value reading that we can make sense of the word. I mean, it's not completely cryptic. It's not meant to be a confusing book. There is a sequence to it. There's a chronology to it, and it's worth mapping the book of Revelation when we get to the point where we need to understand all of the end-time discussions that came prior to it, namely all the Old Testament books and then the New Testament books, and then finally the book of Revelation. So let's keep reading through ALAN KURSCHNER's notes here. We're talking about defining the pre-wrath view. Antichrist's Great Tribulation. Let's talk about one of those time periods that's very important to this particular perspective. KURSCHNER says, the Great Tribulation will begin at the time of the abomination of desolation, Matthew 24:15 and 21. He goes on to tell us that Jesus, drawing from the prophet Daniel, uses this expression to personify Antichrist as a detestable idol that causes sacrilege, right? Daniel 9:27 as well as 12:11. Paul describes the Antichrist as the man of lawlessness. Let's read that quote. He opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, and as a result, he takes his seat in God's temple, displaying himself as God. So this is Paul being quoted from 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 4, but the comparative reference is from Daniel 7:25 as well as Daniel 11:36, and then we can jump forward to Revelation 13:5-6, where we get more detail about this man of lawlessness, this little horn, this one who's going to come onto the scene one day and persecute God's people. Let's keep reading KURSCHNER. Jesus, Paul, and the book of Revelation warn of the satanic deception of signs and wonders associated with the Antichrist, right? We got Matthew 24:24, 2 Thessalonians 2:9, Revelation 13:13-14. In time, I want you to go back and watch the video or listen to the podcast and look up those references. We'll get to them in time myself, But for now, we're just doing them in overview fashion. But it's worth noting that the pre-wrath perspective, just like all the other really end-time perspectives, does its best to locate its theology within Scripture. I realize that this is what all the other positions are doing, so why wouldn't the pre-wrath view be any different? And of course, every pastor who's worth his seminary training and his ordination should be pointing you back to the Bible when it comes to whatever position that he holds to. The pre-wrath is no different. I say this because even though it's a relatively new position by name, it seeks to assure people that it's not making things up when it comes to the timing and these details that are being expressed. Prewrath is only new in name, but the positions that it's holding to and trying to say that it's rooted in are scripturally foundational. So it's very important that we remember that. Kurschner continues, the Antichrist's great tribulation against believers, Jesus says, will be, quote, unlike anything that has happened from the beginning of the world now or ever will happen, end quote. That is Matthew 24:21, and you can compare this with its reference in Revelation 13. And I might add that Daniel chapter 12 has phraseology that's reminiscent of what Yeshua says about how that it'll be a time of trouble that has not existed on the world since, or in a nation ever since, and never nor ever shall be again. And of course, Daniel was speaking to Jewish people, Jewish readers at the time. So they would have also had this preview or this prophecy that there's going to be coming a time on planet Earth that will be so horrific that it'll be unparalleled. It'll be unequaled. It'll happen, and then there'll never happen a horrific time like it again. And this is quite sobering when you consider the fact that as of our current history, in the year that we're living, 2024, the time of the recording of this YouTube video, we've already had our Holocaust, we've already had our Hitlers, we've had our Stalins, we've had our Mussolinis, we've had our dictators who have come and gone and who have massacred millions and millions of people in an unrighteous fashion. And we think to ourselves, could it get any worse than that? And sadly, if we take these verses at face value, the answer is yes, it will get worse. Kurschner continues, believers will risk persecution because they will refuse to follow Antichrist. Let's read a quote from Revelation. Quote, if anyone is meant for captivity, into captivity he will go. We're speaking about the great tribulation, the wrath of Satan that will be poured out primarily against Jews and Christians, anyone who doesn't take his mark and swear allegiance to his name, etc., etc. They're going to be targeted. But primarily we're talking about Jews and Christians. Anyone is meant for captivity, into captivity he will go. If anyone is to be killed by the sword, then by the sword he must be killed. This requires steadfast endurance and faith from the saints. Revelation 13:10, compare from Revelation 14:9 through 13. So, we're talking about a martyrdom primarily against Christians, but we will also have a martyrdom of Jewish people. And I must add that it would be primarily against the remnant of Israel, faithful Jewish people who hold to the testimony of Jesus and are persecuted and martyred for the name of Jesus. This is terminology that we're going to show you in time. But I believe that if we take all of the relevant passages together, we can make a case that Antichrist is going to persecute anyone who doesn't take the mark, which means there are always going to be people who are not Jewish, who are not Christian, but who refuse any type of governmental marking, for the sake of tracking humans and things like that. There's always people out there that are anti establishment, they're anti I don't want to say they're anti-government, but they're like, hey, you're not going to mark me, you're not going to track me, I want my privacy, you're not going to try to figure out where I am at any time of the day. I've got my rations, I've got my rifles, I've got my rounds of ammunition. I can self-sustain, I can live out on my own farm. And I don't have to take any mark to be fed, buy or sell. I'm self-sustaining. I've got lots of food stored up and things like that. You always got people that are going to say, nope, not going to take the mark, not going to follow any governmental program that says we're going to be branded like cattle, etc., etc. And yet they're not believers and they're not Jewish. So they'll probably be hunted down and killed eventually as well by the likes of Antichrist. But primarily, when we read the verses that talk about martyrdom and the death of people for the cause of Christ, we're talking about Christians, we're talking about Messianic Jews, we're talking about the remnant of Israel, but people who don't take the mark, they're also going to probably lose their life. Let's keep reading Kurschner here. So the great martyrdom that Jesus says, quote, "And if those days had not been cut short, no one would be saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short," right? Jesus tells us that there will be great tribulation. Matthew 24:22, compare from 2 Thessalonians 1:7. But for the sake of not just any old people, this will be cut short. This is why I say it is primarily against Christians and remnant Israel, faithful Israel, is because Jesus calls this group the elect. And it's not just anybody out there who's refusing the mark that is identified as elect. I think that's just fringe groups, people that by inclusion will resist the mark, but this doesn't mean that they're believers. Some of them will come over to the cause of Christ, no doubt. But Jesus says, for the sake of the elect, it will behoove us in time to define who the elect are. Kurschner continues, "It is no wonder why the fifth seal martyrs cry out to God, quote, 'How long, sovereign master, holy and true, before you judge those who live on the earth and avenge our blood,' end quote." That's from Revelation 6:10. Let's keep reading. How will this pre-tribulation sequence take place? What sort of signs can we look for when we're talking about, I said pre-tribulation, I meant that's a faux pas, that's Freudian slip, I meant pre-wrath. How will the pre-wrath view mark out its sequencing? How can we know by way of signs that we're getting near the rapture? What will we be able to look for? According to the pre-trib view, there are no signs. Jesus' return is signless. It's secret. It could happen at any moment. There's nothing that precedes it. However, according to the pre-wrath view, a major sign that happens before the rapture and the day of the Lord is the what Kurschner is calling the celestial disturbance, or what Rosenthal and Zion's Hope Ministries, David Rosenthal, refers to as the cosmic disturbances. So let's read about that. Celestial disturbance. Kurschner continues, God hears their prayers, those martyrs from seal number 5 that we just read about in Revelation chapter 6. God hears their prayers, and he eventually cuts short the great tribulation by the return of Christ to first deliver his people and then execute his wrath upon the wicked. Just before this occurs, Jesus says a celestial event will take place. So let me go back and show you the chart. So we've got pre-wrath rapture. This is not the chart that shows the celestial events. I'll have to bring that into a different chart, different time. But for now, in the pre-wrath model, we've got the Great Tribulation starting at the midpoint of the week with the revelation of Antichrist, the revealing of the man of sin that Paul talked about in 2 Thessalonians. That happens at the midpoint according to the pre-wrath timing. The abomination of desolation is that midpoint event that Christians can be watching for, because at that point in time, that's when the tribulation is also going to commence. And of course, this is worth taking special note of, because that's when Jesus also told us in Luke chapter 21 that when you see the abomination of desolate, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, those who are in Jerusalem need to flee, right? Get out. Those who are in Judea need to flee. So if you're in Jerusalem when the midpoint happens, then you really need to get on the run, because that's when Antichrist is going to surround Jerusalem and he's going to capture Jerusalem. That's according to Old Testament prophecy, right? He will capture Jerusalem, set it up as his some form of capital at that moment, political, I don't know, but definitely militarily type capital, and he's going to start persecuting Jews and Christians. Rapture is what cuts short that great tribulation that will be raging during that time. How long it will go, how many days, how many months, how many weeks, how many years, we don't know. But Jesus says in Matthew 24:15 that when you see the abomination, 21. Let's try that one more time. 29. Matthew 20. Here I'm guessing, and I've got the reference here. Why do I need to guess? Let me just show it to you. Matthew 24, starting in 29. But immediately after this part right here, Matthew 24:29. But immediately after the tribulation of those days. So we're talking about the tribulation being cut short, or at least the rapture being an event that happens alongside of the Great Tribulation, amputating it, something to that effect, because he says those days will be cut short. The rapture itself is that event that cuts short the Great Tribulation, but also is the same event that initiates the day of the Lord. This is what Kurschner is mentioning here. The people are praying that God would deliver them or vindicate their lives being lost, vindicate his great name, obviously. And so God hears their prayers and eventually cuts short the Great Tribulation by the return of Christ, first to deliver his people, Kurschner reiterates, and then to execute his wrath. So this is why we would look at this chart. Rapture and wrath take place on the same day, meaning the rescue of the saints initiates the outpouring of God's wrath. And that's why Brother Eggman's book, The Saints Go Up and the Wrath Comes Down, is very appropriate, right? I love that title. Okay, so there's this celestial event that it takes place just prior to the rapture itself. It doesn't show up on this chart. I apologize. And I don't think, well, maybe I might have it on one of my other charts. Let's take a look. Yeah, check it out. We do have it on this chart. So take a look at this chart. This is the same 7 years that we've been talking about. I'm going to park out on this for a second. Here's the same 7-year slice of history in the green. It's divided into 3.5 and 3.5, right? The blue down below. We've got the war and famines and earthquakes on the top, and the persecution, the apostasy on top. And then we've got the midpoint, and then we've got the Great Tribulation. So what happens is, according to Revelation, the 7 years that is described by Daniel, or the time frame that Jesus describes in Matthew 24, is described by the book of Revelation using seals. Revelation chapter 6. 7 of them to be exact. So if you look at the very bottom of this chart, we've got 1 through 6 seals. The 7th seal is at the far, not the far right. The 7th seal is about 3/4 of the way in. So if you're watching very carefully, if you're looking at the little arrows that talk about the seals, you can see that after seal 5, that's the martyred dead. That's the souls crying out for God to avenge them, for God to be just, for God to pour out his retribution on the wicked humanity that has taken their lives. How long, O Lord, until you judge the wicked? And it's this prayer of the saints that is followed up. It's it's what comes right after that John focuses on in the 6th seal that we can see on this chart, called the sign in the sky. The 6th seal is the signs in the sky. There's another chart that I'll bring in eventually that Zion's Hope put together that shows this cosmic disturbance in a little bit more graphic terms, a little easier for to follow. But if we look at the very top of this chart, we got a part that says coming of the Son of Man, date unknown. Guess what that is? That's the Prewrath rapture. When is it? It's after the tribulation, but prior to the day of the Lord. So it coincides with right after the 6th seal. There's another chart. This one is by Aaron Eggman that has the same information, just in a slightly different chart. It's a little harder to read because it's a lot busier, and some of the writing is a lot smaller, so you have to zoom in to see everything. But there's a big black arrow almost center of the chart that says the rapture pointing up with a question mark. If you're careful to notice, Let me see, can I blow that up? Yeah, give me a second. I'm going to do something and go like this. If you notice, the right here with seal number 6, we've got some graph that looks like some little stars, a little moon slice there, and a sun, a black sun and a red moon and some stars, and a reference to Revelation 6:12-17. That's the cosmic sign that we're kind of referring to. There's a previous chart here. This is similar to Brother Eggman's chart. I think I'll zoom in right there. It's the same thing, basically. Sun, moon, stars, seal number 6 is what we're talking about. So it's that cosmic disturbance that you can see there. So there we go. So that's kind of what's going on. Let me park it back at there. That might be helpful. That's kind of where Kurschner's driving his discussion at the moment. There's a celestial event that's going to take place. Let's read it in our Lord's own words. Quote, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. And this is, of course, a quote from Matthew 24:29-30 from the ESV, but we can also compare it with the synoptics in Luke 21:25-26. But this is also given in detail in Revelation 6:12-17. And in time, what we're going to find out, like Kurschner mentions, the prophet Joel explicitly prophesies that these celestial disturbances will happen before the day of the Lord comes, quote unquote. That's Joel 2:31. We also find a reference in Isaiah chapter 13 that we'll get to in time. But this celestial disturbance, or these cosmic disturbances, are a sign, right? Revelation chapter 6, the 6th seal. The cosmic disturbances are a sign that precede the rapture, which itself precedes the day of the Lord. So it's a sign that we Christians can and should be looking for.